It started in silence, not with tanks, not with aircraft, but with whispers. When the German war machine swept across Europe between 1939 and 1941, it looked unstoppable. Cities crumbled overnight, armies surrendered in weeks, and the Wehrmacht's banners flew over half the continent, from Paris to Kiev, from Athens to Warsaw. The world watched the rise of an empire that believed it could not be challenged. But deep in the forests and mountains, far from the polished boots of German patrols, a different kind of war was taking shape. It had no front lines, no headquarters, no medals, just men and women who refused to accept occupation. They called themselves partisans. In the beginning, they were few, a scattered mix of deserters, farmers, miners, students, and soldiers who'd escaped capture. Armed with old rifles, hunting guns, and stolen grenades, they hid in caves, forests, and barns. They had no uniforms, no supplies, and no guarantees of survival. But they had something far more dangerous: resolve. German generals dismissed them as bandits. They saw them as an inconvenience, not a threat, criminals preying on soldiers and civilians alike. Orders were issued for mass reprisals. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned. Civilians were executed. The message was simple: resist and die. But fear couldn't kill determination. Every execution, every burning village, only deepened the hatred. And that hatred became resistance. In Belarus, small bands of Soviet partisans hid in the thick forests and swamps, striking German patrols, sabotaging roads, and disappearing into the trees before reinforcements arrived. In Yugoslavia, Tito's fighters gathered in the mountains, forming a disciplined army of guerrillas who fought not only Germans, but collaborators and rival factions. And in France, the Maquis, French resistance fighters, began to organize in secret, training in the countryside, gathering weapons dropped by Allied aircraft, and waiting for the moment to strike. At first, their actions were small: a train derailed, a bridge destroyed, a German supply truck ambushed on a lonely road. But with each act of sabotage, the myth of German invincibility began to crack. The partisans weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting for identity, for revenge, and for the hope that one day their homelands would be free again. Every bullet fired from the shadows was a message. The occupation would never be absolute. By the end of 1942, German officers began to notice something disturbing. Supply shipments weren't arriving. Rail lines once thought secure were being blown apart faster than they could be repaired. Convoys vanished into the night, and entire platoons disappeared in the forests of Eastern Europe. Something invisible was spreading. A movement without borders, without uniforms, but with one mission: to bleed the Wehrmacht from within. The Germans had built their empire through speed and terror. Now they were facing enemies who couldn't be captured, who didn't stand and fight. They disappeared into the woods after every strike. It was the beginning of a new kind of war, the war of the unseen, fought not with might, but with persistence, cunning, and courage. The Germans didn't know it yet, but the partisans they mocked as peasants with rifles were about to become one of their most persistent nightmares. By 1943, the forests of Europe were alive. What began as scattered groups of fugitives had grown into something the German High Command could no longer ignore: entire underground armies operating beyond their control. These weren't just peasants with rifles anymore. They were coordinated, trained, and dangerous. In the Soviet Union, the partisans had become a massive force. Over 200,000 men and women operating behind enemy lines. They had radio operators in contact with Moscow, supply drops from the air, and entire networks of spies embedded in German-controlled towns. They mapped troop movements, sabotaged bridges, and ambushed convoys carrying vital fuel and ammunition to the Eastern Front. The Germans tried to crush them with brute force. Entire divisions were pulled from the front lines to sweep the forests of Belarus and Ukraine. Villages were burned, civilians executed. Anyone suspected of aiding the partisans was hanged in the town square. But for every partisan killed, 3 more rose to take their place. In Yugoslavia, the resistance was exploding. Led by Josip Broz Tito, the Yugoslav partisans weren't just raiding supply depots, they were retaking towns, establishing local governments, and waging full-scale battles against German and Italian troops. Their operations tied down over 500,000 Axis soldiers, men who could have been fighting in Russia or Italy, but were instead trapped in a grinding guerrilla war in the Balkans. Meanwhile, in France, the Maquis were growing bold. Allied command, through the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, began smuggling weapons, explosives, and instructors to the resistance they trained in secret, learning how to destroy rail lines, how to wire bridges, how to kill silently. By day, they looked like ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, mechanics, priests, but at night, they became saboteurs. Entire German supply trains carrying fuel, ammunition, and tanks were derailed by a single well-placed bomb. Communications lines went dark. Bridges vanished in the night. And always, the partisans disappeared before dawn. Even in Italy, after Mussolini's fall, the partisans rose in the mountains of the north, ambushing German troops retreating from southern Italy. They sabotaged fuel depots, assassinated officers, and guided Allied paratroopers through the hills. German generals began to realize a horrifying truth. The enemy wasn't just in front of them. The enemy was everywhere. Supply lines that once stretched smoothly across occupied Europe were now bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Fuel shortages crippled tanks. Ammunition failed to reach the front. Reinforcements disappeared into the woods before they ever saw combat. And it wasn't just the loss of supplies. It was the psychological collapse. German soldiers began to fear the forests. Convoys refused to travel at night. Every shadow, every rustle in the trees could be death. By mid-1943, one general wrote in his diary, "We no longer control the land, only the roads we stand on. Everything else belongs to the partisans." The partisans had turned Europe's heartlands into a battlefield. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't march in formation, but they achieved what few armies could. They made the Germans feel hunted. And as the tide of the war began to turn, as the Red Army pushed west and the Allies prepared for invasion, these hidden warriors would become the blade waiting in the dark, ready to strike when the world least expected it. By 1944, the tide of war had shifted, but not by armies alone. While Allied bombers tore through the skies above Europe and Soviet tanks crushed through the Eastern Front, a quieter war was raging in the shadows, and it was about to explode into the open. The partisans, once ragged, hunted, and scattered, had become something terrifyingly organized. They were no longer just hiding in forests. They were seizing towns, rail junctions, and entire regions. In France, the Maquis received a coded message from London. The dice are on the carpet. It was the signal they had been waiting for. D-Day had begun. Within hours, thousands of French resistance fighters cut telephone lines, blew up bridges, and blocked the roads leading to Normandy. German reinforcements couldn't move panzer divisions that might have crushed the Allied landings sat stranded, their supply convoys burning in ditches. One German officer in Normandy later admitted, "The partisans caused more delay than the bombing." In Eastern Europe, Soviet partisans coordinated massive uprisings behind German lines. Entire rail networks were destroyed in synchronized attacks. Fuel trains derailed, depots burned for days, and communication between divisions collapsed. In Belarus, Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that annihilated Germany's Army Group Center, was made possible largely because partisan forces had already shattered the German rear. The Red Army rolled forward, while the partisans rose from the forests to join them, turning chaos into total collapse. And in Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans were now an army in all but name, over 800,000 strong, controlling vast territories. They liberated cities before the Allies even arrived, forcing the Germans into retreat without ever needing a conventional front line. But it wasn't just Europe's heartlands that burned. In Italy, partisan groups cut the retreat routes of the Wehrmacht, ambushing convoys in the mountain passes and turning every mile into a blood-soaked gauntlet. When Rome was liberated, the partisans had already cleared most of the countryside, inch by inch, with sabotage and ambush. Even Norwegian resistance fighters struck where it mattered most, sinking German ships, destroying heavy water plants, and crippling the Nazi atomic program before it could even begin. Across the continent, one pattern emerged. The partisans weren't just disrupting the German war effort. They were bleeding it dry. Every destroyed bridge meant days of delay. Every ambush meant fewer soldiers at the front. Every dead officer meant confusion, fear, and collapse. For the first time since 1939, the Germans weren't just fighting enemies on the front lines. They were fighting ghosts in their own occupied territories. Villagers who once saluted now whispered. Roads that once carried supplies now carried fire. And the once mighty Wehrmacht began to crumble not from a single blow, but from 1,000 invisible hands tightening around its throat. As the Allies advanced from west and east, they didn't enter enemy territory alone. The forests, fields, and cities of Europe had already risen up to meet them. By summer 1944, the Shadow War had become a people's war. The partisans weren't in the background anymore. They were leading the charge. By late 1944, the once invincible German war machine was bleeding from every corner of occupied Europe. Its supply chains shattered, its morale rotted, and its soldiers lived in constant fear. Not just of Allied bombers overhead, but of the shadows that moved in the forests, the whispers in the villages, and the unseen eyes watching every convoy that passed. The partisans had become the nightmare the Germans could never wake from. Every road they traveled could be mined. Every train track could be blown up. Every officer could vanish in the night. And the reprisals, meant to terrorize the population into obedience, only fueled the resistance further. When a village was burned, 10 more took up arms. When civilians were executed, recruitment tripled. When the Germans hung partisan fighters in the town square, their comrades came back a week later and blew up the garrison. In France, the Maquis turned the countryside into a death trap for retreating German forces. Bridges that had once carried tanks now collapsed under their weight. Snipers haunted supply routes, and small hit-and-run teams ambushed convoys daily. Entire German divisions had to fight their way home, not from Allied armies, but from farmers and mechanics turned freedom fighters. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans were no longer guerrillas. They were an army. Over 1 million strong by the end of 1944, they liberated cities like Belgrade. With little help from the Soviets, German generals once sent to crush them were now negotiating for safe retreat. But none was given. For every German patrol that entered a Yugoslav valley, few ever returned. In Greece, partisan groups struck from the mountains, destroying railways that supplied Rommel's Afrika Korps years earlier. And now they turned those same tactics against the retreating Wehrmacht. When German columns fled north, the partisans cut them off, taking prisoners and liberating towns long before Allied boots arrived. And in Eastern Europe, Soviet partisans didn't just support the Red Army, they paved the way for it. When Operation Bagration unleashed chaos on the Eastern Front, German troops found their retreat routes destroyed, fuel depots sabotaged, and bridges gone. Their lines of communication were gone before the first Soviet shell even landed. Even in Italy, the partisans played a decisive role. As the Allies pushed up the peninsula, Italian resistance groups tied down thousands of German troops who might have reinforced the Gothic line. By 1945, when Mussolini tried to flee north, he was captured not by Allied soldiers, but by partisans who brought his fascist regime to a brutal end. The German commanders were forced to confront an awful truth. They could no longer control the territories they occupied. Their armored divisions were useless against invisible enemies who struck from every shadow. A German officer in France wrote bitterly in his diary, "We fight an army we cannot see, supplied by a people we cannot trust." The Reich's control was crumbling, not in great battles, but in the silence between them, in the forests, the mountain passes, the sabotaged railways, and the villages that refused to bow. By 1945, as the Allies advanced on Berlin from both sides, the partisans had already liberated half of Europe in spirit. In Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Italy, and beyond, they had taken up the burden of freedom long before the front lines arrived. The fall of Nazi power didn't just come from Allied strength. It came from the will of ordinary men and women who refused to surrender, who fought with what they had, and who taught the world that courage didn't always come from armies. Sometimes it came from the shadows. By the war's end, these bandits and terrorists, as the Nazis had called them, stood among the victors. The occupiers had fallen, and the people had risen. The world would never forget what happened when courage met tyranny and won. When the war ended, the guns fell silent, but the echoes of the resistance never faded. Across the scarred lands of Europe, people remembered the faces of those who had fought not for medals or orders, but for the right to live free. The partisans were not professional soldiers. They were teachers, farmers, mothers, priests, miners, and students. Yet they had done what trained armies could not. They shattered the illusion of Nazi invincibility. They fought without air cover, without heavy weapons, and often without hope, but with a fire that no dictatorship could extinguish. Their war was waged not in the open fields of Normandy or the skies over Britain, but in the forests of Poland, the mountains of Yugoslavia, the valleys of Greece, and the vineyards of France. It was a war of whispers and sabotage, of courage and consequence. It was fought by those who knew that every act of defiance, cutting a wire, derailing a train, passing a message, might cost their lives. When liberation came, it was not just the armies that marched home in triumph. It was the spirit of the people, the invisible soldiers of the underground, who had kept the flame alive through the darkest years. In France, they stood shoulder to shoulder with Allied troops as Paris was freed. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans entered cities they had liberated themselves. In Greece and Italy, resistance fighters rose from the hills to reclaim their nations. And in Poland, even though their struggle ended under new occupation, their defiance remained a symbol of unbreakable will. For the Germans who once mocked them, the irony was bitter. The partisans they had called bandits were now hailed as heroes. The men who once commanded tanks and divisions were prisoners. And those who had fought in the shadows now walked in daylight, their names etched into history, their stories whispered across generations. They proved that war is not just won by generals or nations, it's won by people who refuse to kneel. Today, their legacy stands as a reminder that tyranny can never last when courage endures. The resistance movements of World War II were not just military campaigns. They were the soul of a continent refusing to die. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. Because while the Reich burned and its banners fell, the spirit of freedom, carried by ordinary men and women, still stood tall among the ruins. So the next time you hear about great battles and famous generals, remember the invisible armies. Remember the farmers who hid rifles under haystacks, the women who risked everything to pass secret messages, and the partisans who lit the night sky with the fire of their rebellion. They were the reason Europe rose again. They were the shadow that swallowed the conqueror, and they were the forgotten warriors who proved that freedom, once fought for, never truly dies. If this story moved you, if you believe courage doesn't always wear a uniform, then subscribe right now. Join us as we uncover more untold stories of the men and women who shaped history from the shadows. Don't just watch history, be part of remembering it.